I guess the only reason I'm even telling this story is to somehow try and move past the things that happened that day and the trauma and scars it left on me. My therapist says to move on. I have to talk about it, and I don't want to talk to anyone I actually know. Here I am telling strangers on the internet about the worst day of my life. I live in what some people would call a third world country. I'm from the United States originally, but I moved to this place when I was relocated for work. Honestly, I figured it wouldn't be that bad considering I was a man and men are usually treated well in that country. I don't want to name exactly where this was because I don't want things to turn political or for people to make assumptions about what happened just based on the place. Part of me is also worried that if I tell you where this happened, you'd find an article about it online and find out who I am. Maybe that's just the paranoia though. Anyway, a little bit about me. I'm currently 32 years old, but when this happened, I was in my late 20s. I was somewhat overweight and didn't get out very much, so when my job needed someone to relocate to another country, I volunteered. I figured it would be the push I needed to try new things and go new places. I had to take 5 flights just to get there, and by the time the last flight landed, I was completely exhausted and not at all excited about starting work in a whole new place. I had a few days to settle into my new apartment before my first day at the office about 30 minutes away. What I do isn't exactly super interesting. Lots of paperwork and phone calls really. A part of me didn't even understand why they actually needed me to be there. Everything I was doing was something that could be done back home. But I was already there now and I had a contract for 1 year, so I had to stick it out whether I liked it or not. Got to the apartment and was immediately disappointed. It looked nothing like the pictures that had been posted online. In fact, it was a whole different layout. When I tried to complain to the building manager, he just stared at me until I realized he couldn't even understand what I was saying. I made my way back up to my cockroach-infested apartment and had no hope for the next year. I immediately regretted my decision to come here, but unfortunately there was no going back now. My first day went okay actually. No one cared I was there, and for the most part everyone left me alone. My boss barely spoke any English, so we said as much as we could to each other in terms of introductions before I went and sat down at my dusty old desk. It seemed this was going to be the whole next year of my life. The first week was alright. I noticed a few of my coworkers staring at me and whispering things to each other while they did. I honestly didn't care at all though, considering I had no idea what they were saying anyway. I like keeping to myself. It made the time pass by faster when I zoned out everything else. I even bought myself a pair of noise-canceling headphones to make it even quieter. Next month, I got a notice not to come in for a few days since they were remodeling. I happily stayed home, and thank God for the time off. It was much needed. By the time I went back to work, they had added all new cubicles and lots of furnishing as well. It was much nicer. Honestly, it made me want to stay at work longer, to escape all the bugs in my apartment building. I found myself soon working 12-hour days. At first, I would have thought this would be an issue for the company, considering 4 of those hours were overtime. But it didn't seem to be a problem. I was actually getting so much work done, I got an email from corporate congratulating me on how fast I was helping the branch catch up with their late work. By month 3, I had the whole routine down. I woke up at 6 a.m. every morning, made myself breakfast, checked the news. Then, 7:30, I began my walk to work, and by 8, I was there. Usually, I was the first person there as well. I would put on my noise-canceling headphones and get right to work. Some days, I wouldn't take them off at all. This was one of those days. I got to work at 8 a.m. as usual. Everything seemed very normal. I sat down at my desk, plopped in my trusty noise-canceling headphones, and got right to work. I loved sitting in those cubicles because they secluded me so much more than regular desks. Even in the little doorway to the cubicle, I added a curtain to block myself off more. It was like my own little room where no one ever disturbed me. It was great. I got to work, and for the next few hours, everything went smoothly. I kept my head down, did my work as usual. Everything was like every other day. At around 1 p.m. though, I felt a vibration underneath my feet of a lot of footsteps walking quickly out of the office. It even felt like some people might be running. but it was lunchtime and I naively chalked it up to people heading out to lunch. I never even lifted my head to see what was going on. By 1:15, the power had suddenly gone out. The whole floor was dark, with only bits of sunlight peering in between the blinds on the windows. I removed my headphones and stood up, and that's when I realized I was the only person still in the office. I walked to our manager's doorway, but he was also nowhere to be found, and that's when I noticed the smoke. It had gone from completely clear air in the room to smoke so thick I could barely see 5 feet in front of me in the span of only 10 minutes. It was seeping from the ground below me. I started to cough so hard, it felt like my lungs were going to burst out of my chest. I started to make my way to the stairwell, but with every step it felt like my body was getting heavier and heavier. At some point I ripped off my shirt, balled it up and shoved it against my mouth and nose to try and filter the air. I knew my lungs had already absorbed a lot of smoke, but I had to do something. The ground underneath me was hot, burning hot. My shoes were almost melting, and the bottoms of my feet were being branded like white-hot metal. It was excruciating. I had about 50 feet between me and the stairwell door, but to me in this situation, it felt like 500 feet. At that point, the walls around me even started to catch fire. The flames were so hot that even when I was standing 20 feet away from them, they were burning my skin. I was terrified. It was like I was a kid again. All I wanted was my dad to come and save me from this horrible situation. I started to pray, praying every second that I was in the building. Every second I felt my skin burning away. Please God, let me survive this. Give me the strength to escape this building. Every step I took was like walking on lava. I was determined to live though. The building around me even started to fall apart as I was now surrounded by flames. At 1:35 p.m., I made it to the stairwell door. I placed my hand on the door handle, and the searing pain of the metal touching my skin had me pulling my hand back so fast, I hit myself in the chest. I had to think quickly. I lowered my shirt from my mouth and wrapped it around my hand. I knew the handle would still be hot, but any barrier was better than none. I braced myself for the pain I was about to experience, and again set my hand on the knob and pulled it open quickly. It hurt, but at this point, I think my body was going into shock. I felt my legs burning, and when I looked down, I saw my pants had burned away entirely from my body. My legs were now exposed to the flames and heat that had started to engulf me. I knew I had to make a decision. I had to go as fast as I could down those stairs, no matter how painful it would be, or I would die. I took as deep a breath as I could and began jumping down the stairs. I skipped as many as I could in hopes it would get me down faster. I screamed in pain with each step, but eventually I found myself on the bottom floor, in front of the door that would lead me to salvation. The stairwell had begun to fall apart above me, pieces of metal and wood raining down as I pushed against the door. Once outside, I was greeted by firemen yelling in my face in a language I didn't understand. The shock must have worn off, because then everything went black. The next thing I remember, I was in the hospital. The doctor told me that 70% of my body had been seriously burned, but I would likely survive. The pain even in the hospital was excruciating. I called my mom and dad, who were already arranging for me to be transported home for better medical care. I was in the hospital in that foreign country for 2 months before I was stable enough to be moved. The worst part was the debridement, which is where they remove dead tissue from your wounds. They were literally taking off chunks of skin to ensure I didn't get an infection. I knew it was part of the treatment process, but it felt like literal torture. For the longest time, I blamed my coworkers. I felt like they'd left me there to die. In reality, because I was so isolated, my boss told me they didn't even know I was still there. I'd made no sound throughout the whole day, and because I always arrived at work 30 minutes early, no one had actually seen me come in. My resentment toward them eventually went away, and I realized it was not their fault. As it turned out, a car had caught on fire parked in the alleyway next to the building. Because the building was so old, it was made of cheap materials, and they'd caught fire easily as well. There was no stopping it. Apparently, my boss thought that everyone had gotten out. I guess no one had thought to get a total head count. Apparently, when I'd come out of the building, everyone was shocked and terrified to see I'd been in there the entire time. Recovery has been one of the hardest things I've ever gone through, but I'm grateful I escaped with my life. One thing I've learned from all of this is that it really doesn't pay to be a totally isolated loner. Make sure someone knows where you are at all times. I'm a 42-year-old woman with a fairly normal life. I want to make it clear, I don't mean normal in a bad way either. I've always planned for my life to be fairly average, if you will. I'm just not the kind of person that has super extravagant dreams I want to accomplish. I've always been the sort of person who is completely okay with having an office job and working an 8-to-5 workday. Sometimes I wondered why I never had the ambition to be great like other people did growing up, but I figured it must have been because my parents were also just fine with ordinary lives. This specific situation happened when I was 40 and working in an accounting office as a secretary/receptionist. It was quite boring work, but I really didn't mind. It was only some hours out of my day and the pay was fairly decent as well. There was, however, one con to this job, and that con was a man named Gary. Gary had joined the company a few years back. I had been working there for about 5 years by this time, and I'd seen many a person come and go. I never really expected anyone to stay for very long, given the fact that the building wasn't very nice. I also knew for a fact that the assistant position he was filling in for one of the accountants did not pay well at all. I kind of felt bad for him at first, to be honest. He was very optimistic about the job and super excited, but by the time a full year had passed, he was obviously very sad and bored. I guess feeling bad for him is what made me try to befriend him in the first place, and that's something I'll regret forever. Gary was a nice and seemingly regular guy at first. We went off for lunch a couple of times a week as friends, and sometimes went for a drink after work. Now, let me tell you, Gary was extremely boring, possibly the most dry and unfunny person I've ever met. All he'd ever talk about was himself and his cats. I mean, there's only so many times you can hear a person talk about their cat's favorite toys and treats before you just want to bury your head in the sand. It was painful, but I continued my friendship with him because I knew I was the only friend he had. I would have hated to hurt his feelings at the time. After around 6 months of us being friends and spending short periods of time together outside work, I noticed Gary becoming very clingy. He would text me during my days off to ask where I was and if I'd meet him for lunch and drinks, and when I politely said no, he'd get extremely angry. It was our tradition. I couldn't mess up our tradition, and stuff like that. The other thing he really hated was whenever I mentioned my husband. He really hated that. If we were having a conversation and I ever brought it up, Gary would scoff and ask to change the subject. If he asked to get lunch with me and I told him I had plans with my husband, he'd actually tell me to cancel them with my husband so I could go with him instead. I found this extremely strange, obviously. Eventually, he just became this person who was trying his best to control me. Only, Gary was just a guy I worked with. It's not like he could tell me what to do, so I just started to ignore him. One day, however, he overheard me talking to another coworker about a barbecue I was having at my house that coming weekend that my husband and I were hosting. I had actually asked the other coworker not to mention it because I didn't want Gary to know about it. Of course, he found out though. She basically yelled across the whole office how excited she was to the barbecue and how happy she was to be invited. Well, there's that, I guess. As expected, Gary came rushing up to me with an angry look on his face. He began littering me with questions on why he wasn't invited and if I hated him now. He was talking so fast I couldn't even get a word in if I wanted to. Finally, I just ended up raising my voice and telling him to shut the fuck up. He didn't like that, but I followed the shut up with an invite to the barbecue. I kind of had to invite him at that point. I made up some dumb excuse as to why I hadn't done so, with something like, "Oh, I wanted to invite you in person." He bought it, of course, which was all that mattered. In my head, the barbecue was already ruined just by the fact I knew he'd be there. The weekend rolled around and my husband and I were setting up. It was pretty hot outside and we had a swimming pool we'd set up to utilize that day. People started to arrive and we began cooking hamburgers and hot dogs. After an hour, Gary still hadn't showed up. I was really hoping that meant he wasn't going to. There he was though, stepping into our backyard from the side gate, wearing a Hawaiian shirt and, to everyone's shock and horror, a Speedo. I was confused and upset. I felt like walking over and telling him to leave, but I convinced myself causing a scene would have been a bigger issue, and I should just let it go for a while. After a while, our daughter came home and joined the party as well. She was 16 at the time. Most of her time during the barbecue was spent sunbathing by the pool. I began to notice Gary staring at her, which of course I found creepy. I walked up to him and asked him what he was doing, but instead of answering, he just pointed at my daughter. The words that came out of his mouth disgusted me. "Who is she? Oh my God, the things I'd do to that girl." The anger I felt in that moment was so intense I could barely find the words to tell him to get out. Instead, I went over to my husband and told him what Gary said. I watched my husband storm over to him. I didn't hear what was said between them. Instead, I saw Gary storm out of our backyard and yell some expletives before closing the gate. I asked my husband what had happened, but his only response was that he'd handled it. For the next few weeks, work was normal, beside the occasional glares I received from Gary. I didn't care though. I was just glad to have him out of my life. After work, he would always watch me walk to my car. I found this unnerving, of course, but I tried not to think about it too much. Gary had become known for being a little creep around the office, so this was normal in everyone's minds. He tried texting me multiple times to apologize, but I ignored him. I was done with our friendship, if you could even call it that. I just wanted him to leave me alone. About a month after the barbecue, my daughter started complaining to me that whenever she was in her room, she felt like someone was watching her. Every time I went in there, she had the curtains fully closed. She said it was the only way she felt safe. I felt bad for her, but we could never catch anyone looking into her window, so there wasn't much we could do other than tell her we'd keep her safe always. One day, though, everything changed. My husband always picked up our daughter from school after soccer practice, but this day he happened to be running a little bit late. When he pulled up, he noticed a car pulled up beside her. She had already opened the door and was about to get in. My husband yelled out of the window and asked her what she was doing. Almost immediately, the car sped away, leaving our daughter standing on the curb of her school, confused. What she told my husband shook me to my core. She said after she'd gotten done with soccer practice, she went to the front of campus where she usually met my husband and waited for him to get there. He didn't think to text her at the time that he was running late, as she was waiting nonetheless. She knew he'd be there eventually. Instead, though, Gary pulled up in front of her, told her he was my friend and that he was told to go pick her up. Of course, that wasn't true at all, but she'd seen him around before and assumed he must be telling the truth. That's when she opened the door and was about to get in. After she told my husband what happened, he called the police, who managed to actually track down Gary. He was charged with attempted kidnapping, and when they searched his car, they found duct tape, rope, and zip ties, as well as over 100 pictures of her in her bedroom and at her school. They said he'd been stalking her for the past month, and this must have been thoroughly planned. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison eventually, as well as receiving a no-contact order. His 2-year sentence went by fast, and he's out now. We changed houses and had her switch schools just in case. So far, we haven't seen him around. We don't know what he had planned for her that day, but we're glad we never had to find out. So this happened a long time ago, but I've never forgotten it, as it was one of the strangest encounters my family and I have ever had. One time as a child, I went with my family to the grocery store. It was our monthly trip to stock up on groceries. so we were going to be there for quite a while. I was about 12 at the time, so by that age I had a good understanding of how to read people. We started in the produce aisle when suddenly a strange man caught my eye. He was standing awkwardly close to us, sort of fake browsing through everything. His body language seemed off as well. He was standing with his back to us, but something was weird about the way he was positioned. As we moved down the aisle, he would always rotate so his back was facing us. As we got a little closer, I could tell he was wearing those see-behind glasses, those gimmick sunglasses that have hidden mirrors on the inside of the lenses so you can see behind yourself. Yeah, that sort of thing. He had a dirty gray zip-up jacket on, and long messy hair as well. Had to be in his 40s at least. As our shopping went on, wherever we went, I would see him standing there, staring at me from across the store. He would keep his distance from us always, but still be within eyesight no matter where we were. About 30 minutes in, my mom still hadn't noticed, but he was really starting to bother me. Unfortunately, my mom didn't believe me at first. Eventually, we got to the refrigerator aisles, and that's when it got really weird. Whatever aisle we were in, he would quickly pace past us occasionally. At that point, he wasn't even trying to look like he was shopping. It was so obvious that my mom and sis were also starting to notice as well and get quite concerned. At one point, we were grabbing something off one of the shelves, and I could see him just standing on the opposite aisle, peeking in between them at us. His sunglasses were on still, but now he had his hood up all the way. We started to walk faster and do random zigzags around the store to see if he really was following us. At least we could try to lose him. He would always keep up though, all in a very sneaky way at that. He would always just appear at the opposite end of the aisle, keeping up with us the whole time. At this point, we pushed up to the customer service area to talk to a manager about it, and at that point the man completely disappeared. We informed the manager and she was very helpful. She actually went to go try and find the guy and talk to him. We waited at the counter until she paced back to us with a confused look on her face. She walked up to my mother and told us, "He said you're his mom." At this point, my mom and sister were quite concerned and confused. The manager rang us up herself and said we should leave, and they would escort the strange man away. We walked out to the car, staying close to our mother, when we were met with a horrible sight. The man was just standing across the parking lot from our car, with his head tilted and a big grin on his face. We floored it out of there, but we could still see him standing there, watching us leave the whole time. This story happened when I was younger and braver, and did a lot of stupid things without thinking beforehand. It's quite a wild ride, and it's all true as well. I used to work at a pizza shop down the street from 2 p.m. until closing. I usually didn't get off until 11 or so at night because of this. I did have a car, but it was close enough to walk, so I mostly did that to save gas. This particular night, I was doing my usual thing, jamming to one of my playlists and very tired. I was happy to have such a good job though, and generally happy with the way my life was going. Up ahead, about a block or so from my place, I saw a pretty attractive guy in dark clothing walking around. Not with much purpose really. He was taller than me, about 5'10" to 6'ish or so, and had shaggy brown hair. The closer I got to him, the more I could tell he was really good looking. Like even in the dark of night, I could feel myself blushing a little. His features kind of escape me now, but I do remember his hair and thick eyebrows. I took an earbud out, and because I'm from a dangerous city and never really cared about stranger danger, I decided to talk to him a bit. Hey, how's your night going?" "Oh, it's good, just looking to get drunk." "Oh, that I can help with. I've got a mini bar at my place. I live just down the street if you want." That was not exactly verbatim how the conversation went. During the walk back to my place, I didn't really get any red flags from this guy either. He seemed totally normal and was actually pretty nice. I was honestly thinking, wow, through sheer luck I met this super hunky guy that seems cool and fun. I was beside myself, really. We get to my apartment on the second floor. I jump into host mode and offer him to have a seat and make himself comfortable. The apartment was about 640 square feet in total, so it was pretty small. Except for the bathroom, you could pretty much see the rest of the apartment from any area inside. I headed into the kitchen, and while I was pouring the drinks, I glanced back over at him out of curiosity. It was then that I noticed the first red flag. As I was asking him questions, he was more delayed with his answers, especially more so than he was on our walk there. He was starting to act kind of odd. I go back over to the couch, pass him his drink, and sit down next to him. "So, what do you do for work?" I asked. "Oh, I'm not here for sex." He put down his drink on the table. "What do you mean? I'm not here for that either." He stood up. "What you got?" he asked me. His nice guy vernacular and friendly face were now gone. I was having a hard time understanding what he meant by that. I said, "What you got?" The second I stood up, he pushed me backward. I basically got knocked off my feet, hitting the floor but not hard enough to get knocked out or anything. I jumped right back up, but he'd already grabbed my laptop and my work bag. As I started towards him, he cut around me and made his way toward the front door. I was right behind him when he made it outside. I managed to grab a hold of him, and we tussled again in front of the door. Now I shouted out, calling on help from the neighbors. It was late at night though, so no one came. "Please help, I'm being robbed!" The thing is, he had my laptop. Not just any laptop, I hate to admit it, but my entire life was on that computer at the time. Important photos I didn't have backed up, thousands of dollars in music programs, video game programming stuff for a development team I helped, really expensive software. It was in my mind irreplaceable. I gave chase down the stairs across the dog walk park, and as I started to gain on him, we tussled again. The only thing I could focus on was my laptop. I knew I had to, at any cost, get that computer back. That was all I cared about. Somehow I got a grip on it. I tugged at it again. I guess he decided it was not worth all this struggle. He got up and started to take off once again. I realized he still had my work bag, which had my cell phone and my wallet in it. I ran after him again. This time he shouted back at me, "Follow me and I'll stab you again." This made me stop in my tracks as he got away. Underneath a street lamp nearby along the sidewalk, I immediately started to inspect myself. I was stabbed? No way. There was no way that just happened. Then I saw blood running down my leg. I saw blood pouring down my arm too. I saw two places where he cut me real good. I was scared, but the blood made it look worse than it was. I decided that was enough. I got my laptop, and that's all I really needed anyway. I hobbled back home, got inside, and locked my door. I called the cops using my neighbor's friend's phone the next day, and filed a police report explaining the situation, showing the stab wounds. I also declined medical services, since I couldn't afford that at the moment. In the end, all that guy got was a crappy cell phone and a wallet with like $30 in it. The cop called my friend back several days later and said they were not able to find the guy and that they would keep me posted in the future. That was years ago, so I don't know where the robber is now, but I have every electronic thing of importance backed up on multiple drives to this day. I was at home during the week. It was just me and my child. He was 2 at the time. As we were relaxing together, suddenly somebody knocked at the door. I went to answer it and see who it was. At the door, there were 2 kids. One was a girl around 5 years old, and the other was a boy that looked to be around 9 or so. It's a small town, so I knew the faces of pretty much everyone in the area, but I didn't recognize these 2 kids at all. The girl asked me if I could help them, because the both of them were lost. Obviously, I tried to help. They were about to walk in after I allowed them, but stopped when they saw my son. They immediately walked back out of my living room. The youngest one simply said, "Never mind, we have to go." Just as suddenly as they'd come, they both took off running. I turned around, picked up my son, and walked outside, but I couldn't find them anywhere. It's like they'd just vanished altogether. That was so weird. I live right in the middle of my street, so I'm pretty sure two small kids couldn't have gotten out of sight that quickly. I have no idea what that was all about, or what the hell happened to them, but it was certainly very creepy. To the best of my memory, it was the late 80s, on a hot and sunny day in Toronto, Canada. I was about 12 years old. My friends and I were playing baseball at a public school baseball diamond, which was on a relatively busy street. Just for reference, this school has since been demolished, and a new school building was built right over said baseball diamond. A new building with the exact same name. Also, interesting random fact, the old school building happens to be the location where country singer Michelle Wright did her music video for All I Really Wanna Do. Now, back to the story. A man in his 40s walked up and sat on the bench right beside the baseball diamond, right underneath the hot sun. No hat, nor any other kind of shade. We thought this was a little bit odd, but we kept playing anyway. He was watching us and would shout some comments pertaining to baseball here and there. I suppose he was quite bored and had nothing better to do. Let's call him man number one. The baseball diamond was right beside the busy street, which had its share of poor people, middle-class people, drug addicts, drug dealers, prostitutes, and other weirdos. Needless to say, we were pretty used to random stuff going on around us. As the man kept shouting, though, his uninvited baseball comments began to really annoy me. At this point, I qualified him as creepy. To my relief, he eventually walked away. Soon, it was my turn to pitch. Just then, another man showed up, also in his 40s. Let's call him man number two. Number two also had some comments on our baseball game. He was much more aggressive in his advice, though. Eventually, he came closer and closer until he stepped right up to me and started giving me pitching advice. I thought it was strange that he was so enthusiastic about this, but as a naive young boy, I had the habit of respecting and obeying adults by default. He started getting right up against my path and holding my wrists to show me how to pitch. You know, how you see in the movies, how the guy puts moves on the girls under the guise of teaching them something, like throwing a ball or swinging a golf club. Yeah, he was doing that to me. Now that I think about it, he was right up against my body, too. It was quite inappropriate, to say the least. I was starting to get very uncomfortable. What made it even worse is I could smell the alcohol lingering on him, as he was touching me inappropriately in front of all my friends in broad daylight. I didn't know what to do. I don't know what my friends were thinking, but I remember it being very quiet. I suppose they were in a bit of shock as well. Not as much as I was, though. I think it's just a thing kids have to please people, especially adults. Kinda reminds me of that movie The Lovely Bones, where the predator uses kids' respect for adults against them, manipulating them. When I finally came over my initial shock, I backed away. Just then, I heard man number one shouting some obscenities at man number two. Man number one had returned. He came right at the other guy and started shoving him around. Man number two started to back away, cursing back at man number one, who was still scolding and cursing at him as well. He did some sort of flying kick into his back and sent him stumbling forward. This continued as their now fight moved out of the schoolyard. We watched them for a few minutes until man number two relented and disappeared. Man number one returned looking quite angry and shouted a few things to us. To be honest, I was still in shock and didn't understand what he was saying, though. Finally, he walked away for good this time. Even though I was a little scrapper kid, for years thinking back on it, I felt foolish, violated, ashamed for letting someone put his hands on me like that. I realized later on that I must be grateful to that stranger, man number one, who had nothing better to do that day than sit in the sun shouting uninvited baseball comments at kids, but returned anyway to beat up and chase away a sexual predator trying to prey on a child. Whoever you are, I thank you. And to everyone else, please let kids know they aren't obligated to please or be polite to anyone that makes them feel uncomfortable in any way. They don't owe them anything. Encourage them to be strong and stand up for themselves. Let me start by saying that I was really only looking to hook up. I had just been dumped by my boyfriend, and I'm not the bar type. I figured that an online dating service would be a reasonable option. I used a local personal service and had been talking to a guy for about 2 days before agreeing to meet up with him. His name was Mike, and he told me he used online dating because he was suffering from depression and was on medication that made it hard for him to perform. He decided it was easier to meet girls this way than to meet up in person and have to explain when they started getting physical. He went on to tell me, though, that he had a good feeling about me and that I was exciting him despite his medication. Okay, I was cool with this. I decided to go over to his place to see if we really did have some chemistry. We both seemed to be looking for the same thing, a hookup. When I got there, he was waiting for me in the living room. We started making out, and I could tell he was getting a little aroused, but he was having some issues. When he said he knew what would help and that it was in his bedroom, I willingly followed, walking in behind him. I couldn't help but notice his bed was surrounded by cat condos, lots of them. Some of them were structured to be as tall as I was. I knew that he had some cats, but I assumed he meant 1 or 2 and that they were just hiding when I came over. Nope, he had 10, which all came out from under the bed when we sat down on it. They all went over to their perches on the cat condos to watch us, after rubbing against him and being petted quickly. He then started to make out with me again, and was massively aroused at this point. I was a little bit creeped out though. I like cats, I have 2 myself. But having them watch me pee freaks me out, much less them all watching me have sex. I excused myself, openly admitting that this was a little bit too weird for me. I left and he followed after me. He begged me to give him another chance and to help him with his issues. I left, and for the next several weeks he messaged me over and over, asking me to come over and saying that he had made some real progress with me. The final straw that made me block him was after receiving a photo of him nude on the bed doing unspeakable things with the cats. At that point, I blocked him and informed the authorities. That's not something I want to be messing with. When I was 15, I was in a really bad mental headspace. With that being said, I was depressed, lonely, and desperate for anyone's attention. Against my own better judgment, I made an account on Plenty of Fish. I understand that I put myself in a dangerous position for predators, but I also understand that any man who I told my age should have reported my account and not spoken to me at all. After swiping left and right for about an hour, I met a man I'll call Red. Red was 26, a father of 2 beautiful toddlers, and a Puerto Rican native who had recently moved to Florida. He spoke a fair bit of English and had this charm to him whenever he spoke. When I told him my age, it's scary now to think about just how okay he was with it. He simply told me we would not have any sexual relations, and our interactions would be 100% innocent. We talked for a few months before even mentioning meeting up. When I talked to Red, I felt happy, whole, like I finally had someone supporting me. The first few times we met up, it was perfectly fine. We went to the outlets, Disney Springs, the movies. He was a perfect gentleman. He held my hand, opened doors for me, and kept his hands off me too. We did kiss a bit, but it was never anything too intense. About 6 months into our relationship, I turned 16, and I invited him over to my house, through means of sneaking in my window, of course. He agreed wholeheartedly. We were just hanging out watching a movie when he kissed me in a way he never had before, in a way I'd never been kissed before. It was surprising, and without having to be said, overwhelming. I started to get scared. It finally hit me that this was a grown man, and I was still just a child. I got off my bed and told him he had to leave. I wasn't ready for this. His face immediately contorted into anger, and he stepped towards me, trying to convince me through gritted teeth not to make him leave. He reached out to grab my shoulders, and out of instinct, I shoved his chest to make him back off, only for a harsh shove to be returned right at me. A hot, sharp pain suddenly overwhelmed me, spreading from the back of my head and down the rest of my body. Then everything went black. The next thing I knew, I was hearing a blood-curdling scream. Hazed out and too weak to open my eyes fully, I could just barely tell it was my mom. I felt a wetness on my head, and my body felt so cold now. It was just as I gathered that something was really wrong, that I lost consciousness again. The following time that I awoke was in a hospital bed. My head was pounding and aching in the back. I reached up hazily to feel where the pain was coming from, and my fingertips grazed a row of staples on a now bald patch on the back of my head. It made me wince. Things went by fast from that point on. A doctor and my mother and father explained that I must have slipped and hit my head on the windowsill, being that's where the first impact was made. Before falling the rest of the way onto my floor, my mom had come to my room to wake me up for school in the morning and found me laying there in a pool of my own blood. She thought I was dead because my breathing was so faint. They had no idea as to why I'd slipped, and I was too embarrassed and ashamed of myself to tell anyone. I didn't think I deserved justice for what Red did to me. Later on, I found out my obstacles from the injury, hearing loss in my right ear, as well as an inability to retain old memories. This event and a flash of memories from my childhood are the last things I remember from before the incident. Though I was saddened by this, I was happy to be alive and to never see Red again. Now being 18, a few months ago I signed up for Plenty of Fish once more. I kept my wariness this time though, and didn't actually go on any dates. I looked out for warning signs, and upon the first blocked just about everyone. One day I received a message, and I could see it was from Red. I had blocked him on any other platform, including his number. It simply said, "Hey, how have you been?" I didn't respond, but I looked at his profile. It still said he was 26 years old. I had a feeling he lied to me about his real age. Perhaps I didn't know anything about this man at all. After all, he must have thought he killed me, and he still selfishly ran off without even attempting to see if I was still alive. I moved to California in May. Having lived in Utah for most of my life, this was obviously a big change for me. Where I'm from, it's fairly safe. You can walk home at night and not have to worry about a thing. Everyone warned me how dangerous this new area can be, and to always be vigilant. I carry pepper spray with me at all times. I'd never really had any issues though. That is, until tonight. I ride the fast transit train system often, usually at least a few times a week. To get there from my apartment, I have to walk about a mile, most of which is an enclosed trail that runs behind the neighborhood next to the train tracks. There's one entrance at one end, one in the middle, and one at the other end which opens up to the train station parking lot. Last week, as I was walking home around 10 p.m., I had to walk past a man who was pretty obviously homeless. It seemed like he was searching for something he had lost and talking to himself as well. I had to walk past him to get home. I tried to put my head down and quickly walk past without him noticing. As I did so, though, he blocked my way immediately. "Excuse me. Hey, you! Did you see a thing about this big?" He gestured with his hands. "Did you see it when you were walking through here?" Confused, I told him no and hurried to walk away. I could hear him trying to say something further to me, but I kept on going. Luckily, he did not follow. A few days later, though, I encountered him again on the same trail. He tried to stop me once more, but I simply told him, "Sorry, I don't know what you're looking for." I kept on going. Tonight, though, as I walked to the train station, he was coming out of the elevator as I was going down the escalator. He started yelling at me. "Excuse me! Hey, you! Ma'am!" I ignored him, but he followed and wouldn't leave me alone. I turned around frustrated and finally asked him what he wanted. "Hey, did you see my speaker? Since you were on the trail that night?" I told him no, and I didn't have any idea what he was talking about. "Well, why don't you just let me look in your backpack real quick, 'cause you're looking real guilty right now." Obviously, I told him no. He got furious and took a step towards me. I pulled out my pepper spray. "You better leave me alone. I will spray you." He started screaming about how he didn't care and how I better not have any of his shit. Still, though, he walked away in the end. I walked to the far end of the platform and called my roommate to inform her about what was happening. All of a sudden, the guy comes rushing back to me, clearly holding a hatchet he was trying to poorly hide under his jacket. I grabbed my pepper spray once more. I told him to back the fuck away because I was not playing around. He shoved his hatchet back into his jacket and started backing away. My roommate called the transit police for me. I could still hear the guy screaming from somewhere upstairs in the station. Luckily, my train pulled up right then, and I hopped on without further incident. I'm hoping I never meet that hatchet guy again. I never learned what fucking speaker he was talking about either. This happened in what I'd like to say was 2017 or so. I was around 13, and I was walking home from school. My mom worked late at the time, and my father was out on a business trip. My brother's college was farther away too, so he always came home half an hour to an hour later than me. When I had to go home by myself, I would always take this shortcut there. It was an enclosed path which rarely any people used. As I walked down this day, there was a man a few steps behind me. Since I was a young, dumb child, I didn't really think anything of it. When the enclosed path ended and connected to the sidewalk, I saw the man climb into a white van. Getting slightly suspicious now, I started running over to my house, only to notice the van was now following me. To be sure it was following me and I wasn't just being paranoid, I took a couple of wrong turns, but the van stuck right behind me. I took a detour, and when I thought I lost him, I ran back to my house and locked all my doors and windows once inside. I looked back out the window, and I saw the white van lingering. I frantically called my mother and my brother. My mom wouldn't be home for another few hours, and my brother had another half hour left. My mom told me to go to my parents' room and grab the gun. I went into my parents' room and went to their closet. I had to take it out of the lockbox. Mind you, the closest thing I'd ever done to shooting was archery. Prepared with this gun, I now went downstairs. I grabbed a knife as well, just in case. I went over to the window, only to see a man trying to peek inside. I pointed the gun directly at him and told him that if he did not leave right now, I would shoot him. He turned around and ran away. My brother finally came home a short time after. I told him what happened. We looked over the security camera footage and saw the man trying to get in through the back door, then giving up and coming to the window to try and find another way in. After my mom came home, we called the cops and they tried to trace his license plate number. I would see that same white van passing by my house every day until the police actually finally caught him. It turned out he was an escaped convict who was high on something. This happened to me a couple of years ago. At the time, my fiance didn't even believe me, but I'd been convinced for several weeks that someone was watching our home. Several Amazon packages had been stolen. We'd find cigarette butts by the front door when neither of us smoke, and the doormat had been moved as well. We had just moved to the area recently, and I was feeling really uneasy about all of this. My fiance teased me for watching too many murder mysteries and crime shows, and eventually I dropped the subject altogether. One night we were in bed together nearly asleep when our cat started being really loud. My fiance got up to feed her when he realized we forgot to get cat food when we were out earlier. We both felt a little guilty about going to sleep knowing she was hungry, so he told me not to worry. He would run over to the little 24-hour convenience store that was about 5 minutes down the street. He got dressed to leave and I rolled over to go back to bed. I'm lying on my side in bed facing our window, and right as my fiancé goes to leave, I can see his shadow on the blinds as he walks down the sidewalk. I didn't know it yet, but apparently he forgot to lock the door. Maybe a minute or two after he left, I saw a shadow pass by the bedroom window again and heard footsteps coming back up the sidewalk. I figured since he was tired, he'd probably forgotten his wallet or something and had to come back. This wouldn't be the first time such a thing had happened. I chuckled to myself at how forgetful he is, and the front door opened. My cat jumped off the bed to go and greet him. What happened next took place over the span of maybe 3 minutes or so, but it felt like 3 days in the moment. It was dark and dead quiet in our house. Quiet enough I could hear my cat's little steps on the bedroom carpet suddenly stopping. She then let out the deepest and most terrifying growl I'd ever heard a cat make. At this point, I heard whoever this was take a few steps into our living room, shush her, and then sneeze. It was definitely not my fiancé's voice. There I was, a woman alone at night and naked in bed, scared out of my mind with no idea what to do. This guy clearly knew my fiancé was out. Did he know I was home alone? Was he there to kidnap or hurt me? My phone had died earlier, of course, so now it was off and plugged into the charger. I knew that once I turned it on, AT&T's loud as fuck little jingle was going to betray me, so for right now I was on my own. Thankfully, we keep a shotgun by our bedside. I slipped out of bed, grabbed the gun, and crawled as quietly as I could toward the bedroom door, which was 2/3 of the way closed. I could hear this creep rummaging through our stuff in the living room. He was sneezing over and over. The nerve of this prick. I peeked through the gap in the door, and the outside light was just barely bright enough to illuminate a man hunched over our entertainment center, his back towards me. I silently opened the door the rest of the way and stood still 100% naked and 100% determined to keep myself and my cat safe. I muttered all my stupidity and courage and cocked my gun. In the deepest booming voice my body would allow me to make, I bellowed out, "What the fuck do you think you're doing?" I've never seen a human jump so hard or run so fast. I scared the creep so badly it looked like he was about to launch himself into orbit. I got one good look at his back as he ran outside into the darkness. Then he was gone. I slammed the door shut behind him and yanked my terrified cat out from underneath the couch by their neck. We booked it back to the bedroom with my gun still in hand. I held her close to my chest and started sobbing while I struggled to turn my phone on and dial 911. My fiance got home with a can of cat food moments later and immediately noticed the PS4 on the ground and our other electronics moved around. He found me in the bedroom flipping out. I barely got any words out to explain what happened before the cops showed up too. They were super nice, but unfortunately there was not much they could do. They didn't exactly have a lot to go on, since neither of us had seen the man's face at all, and therefore we couldn't give them a description really. Fortunately, none of our stuff actually ended up being taken, and more importantly, my cat and I were both okay. We were positive, though, that the creep must have lived in our area, as a few weeks later, someone we knew just up the street was robbed in the exact same way. Left his door unlocked for a moment to run to the store, came back and everything had been stolen. I'm not sure if they ever caught the guy. We noped out of that neighborhood pretty quick after. Lock your doors, people. I had an encounter in December of last year that left me feeling very unsettled. I was in a vulnerable position as my partner and I were both female and homeless. We had just purchased an RV to live in, but were having trouble finding a spot to rent. It was an older model and we have pets as well. We parked in the farthest corner of the Walmart parking lot in Bend, Oregon, around 10 a.m. one day. My partner had some errands that needed to be run and took a bus to do them. I held down the fort and watched the dogs while they were away. It was going to be a long day of waiting around for her to get back so we could leave. I went into the store twice to make some purchases early in the day. I worked on some maintenance and art before getting bored enough to take a nap. As I was taking the dogs outside beforehand, 2 police officer vehicles pulled up and parked right next to the RV. At this point, I was preparing for them to ask me to move the vehicle or tell me I can't park overnight or something. After a while of nothing though, I fell asleep anyway. When I woke up, I could tell it was getting toward the evening. The sun was still very much up though, and considering the police presence, I wasn't particularly in the mindset of anything bad happening. Still, I always carry my pepper spray on me. My partner was not back yet. Although I was expecting her to be back late, she had our only phone, so I went into the store to check the time. The officers had moved away by this point, and the parking area in general was pretty barren, save for one van parked in the spot right behind the RV. I entered the store and went to the restroom in the front. I walked over to the electronics department to see what time it was on the displays. It was a few minutes before 6 p.m. I left after only having been in there a few minutes. As I was walking out the door, the crowd in front of me slowly dispersed to veer toward their respective vehicles. I continued walking behind one man, who seemingly parked in the same direction as me. He was tall, thin, and scraggly, with shoulder-length blonde hair and a black hoodie. I walked maybe 30 feet behind him the whole way. As he passed all the cars by the front of the store, I came to the conclusion that this man must be the owner of the vehicle behind the RV. He walked with clear direction, not looking around for where his car was or anything. After passing the main crowd of the parking lot, I got my pepper spray out of my pocket and held it in my hand, just as a routine safety measure. The man walked between the back of the RV and the driver's side door of the van. I figured he was about to get in, but instead he just kinda lingered there. I stopped walking that direction and headed toward a more populated parking area at the next store across the street. It was closer than Walmart from this end. He looked at me and we made eye contact for a while. It felt like he recognized me, as if he'd been staking me out and was surprised to see me leaving the store so soon. I continued to walk away while staring at him, and he watched me before slipping around the side of my RV, where there were some bushes and a fence with no outlet. I'm noping the fuck out at this point, so I went into another store and walked around, blankly staring at things for a bit, trying to formulate my next plan. It was pretty busy in there with no one at the customer service desk, so I went into the gas station next door and asked to use the phone. I called my partner to explain the situation and told her not to go directly to the RV when she got back. I then headed back into Walmart, got a coffee at the McDonald's inside, and waited there for an hour until she was able to return. Perhaps I should have called the police, as I was worried about my animals and my possessions being stolen, but I had recently called 911 while witnessing domestic violence a few days prior. They took 2 hours to show up even though it was in the middle of downtown, and when they did, they harassed me for being homeless anyway. I was worried they'd not only not help, but I might possibly get in trouble for even being there. I don't have a driver's license myself, so having to move the RV before my partner returned would be a dangerous situation. When she arrived, we went back to the RV together. The van was gone. Nothing was touched despite one of the windows not locking properly, but the pets were very spooked. Maybe they decided against doing anything after I'd caught them. I'm not that well off though, obviously, and honestly, one look at that beat-up old thing would tell you I don't have much worth taking. Honestly, just from the look in that guy's eyes, I feel like he wasn't there for my material possessions. Happily, I'll never have to find out for sure. So this happened a few months ago, and I'm still scared to this day. My entire life, I had never really walked home from school all the way. I had always either been picked up or ridden the bus. This year was the first year that I lived near enough the school to walk. I wasn't in the nearby neighborhood where 90% of the kids were. We were only living in our current house temporarily. I would have to walk maybe half a mile to get home, across the highway. At the beginning of the year, when I first started walking home, I didn't want to have to walk by the highway. The high school had a cut-through in the forest that led to a strange and creepy lone road. I wanted to get home fast. I walked down to the forest to get to the cut-through point, when I saw that some older kids appeared to be following me. Maybe I was just being paranoid though. I ignored them, and they actually did turn out to be unimportant. For some reason in my head, I had the Halloween theme just stuck in there, like when Michael Myers would stalk people. It was a really eerie sensation. My gut feeling was that maybe I should have taken the highway instead. Still though, considering the thing with those older kids turned out to be nothing, I kept on just walking through the forested area, and got to that lonely road made out of gravel. There was dead grass right in the middle of it growing out. I could see the area where the highway is. The road seemingly extended deep into this brambly forest. I decided maybe this was a waste of time. I turned around and took the highway path instead. The next day though, I didn't want to give up. I wanted to conquer my fear of this road, so I foolishly went back. It was the same thing. As I walked down that eerie lone road with dead, overgrown shrubs growing on it, I kept getting this eerie feeling the whole time. I noticed there were absolutely zero cars or people coming up and down this road. It was like it was completely abandoned. I kept walking into these big spider webs right in the middle of it, which proved pretty much that there hadn't been cars there in a long time. Otherwise, how would there be so many webs between all these trees? I continued walking down this road leading to nowhere, just going deeper and deeper. I was starting to get a bit scared at this point that a car would come down the road and not see me, or maybe somebody would come and take me. Who would even hear me scream out here? I started jogging up the center. I saw a big gap in the forest where there were power lines. Finally, I thought to myself. The ground next to the lines was still overgrown and full of tall grass and thorns. I kept walking into this area, taking my sweet time. I finally made it to a small ravine. I jumped over it and continued on my way. I eventually got stuck though. There was a big bush. I didn't want to walk through all the tall grass around it and get dirty. I must have been trying to work out how to get around the bush for a good 2 minutes, when suddenly I was slammed with an ominous sensation. I looked up and saw a man standing a good distance away from me. I didn't move or say a word. My heart was pounding. This man was very creepy. He had dark green clothes and shaggy brown hair. He was just staring at me. A big grin came over his face, and he gestured for me to come over to him. He then stepped to the side, where I could no longer see him. I could hear the leaves crunching, though. He was coming after me. The adrenaline had been flowing for about 30 seconds now. I bolted lightning fast up the hill. I didn't care about not getting dirty anymore. I just knew I needed to get the hell out of there. Eventually, I emerged back to the highway area. I turned back to look, but there was no sign of the creepy man. I made it home just fine, and I promised I was never going to try to cut through that forest again. The scariest thing is, though, if he had just stepped slightly to the side before I had seen him in that forest, I would have never noticed him coming. I could have made it up to that area. He would have grabbed me easily, and I would never be seen again. The way he grinned and made his way towards me was very eerie too. Any normal adult would have said something like, "Hey, are you lost? Can I help you?" Nope, this guy just stood there and stared at me for who knows how long. All I know is it caught me completely by surprise. I can safely say I've never tried that shortcut again. I will occasionally go to the top of the highway and look down that path, but I'll never go deep down that road ever again. It's so weird how it seemingly leads to nowhere. I've not encountered the creepy dude since, and hopefully I never will again. So I live on a remote New England street. I just moved here recently from New Mexico. We moved into a gorgeous house about 4 driveways up from a Mormon church. This church has services at random times. I'm agnostic and not really tuned into the schedule that they keep. Tonight I was driving home from work and listening to a new episode from True Crime Garage podcast. I didn't want to stop listening, so instead of driving home, I slowed down my speed so I could finish my episode. I decided to do a slow lap around the church. As I listened, I was super paranoid because of all my true crime obsessions. My car doors always remained locked. Because we live in a safe and upper-class neighborhood, though, I was not terribly on high alert, even though the church was dark. As I cruised slowly around it to enjoy my podcast some more, all of a sudden, a man stepped out of the shadows from behind the church's dumpster and out into the light. He was walking in a bizarre stumbling gait and actually lunged at my car door. He had a beard and was otherwise kempt and clean-looking. So what was with his odd manner of acting? It really scared me, so I floored it and drove off as fast as possible. He lurched after my SUV again, his nails actually scratching the metal of my back door. I was so freaked out that I drove for a long while, not going home but just kind of circling random streets until I finally arrived. My husband is out of town for training. He's military, so it was just me and my 2 pit bulls. They made me feel pretty safe. I do also have a gun that my husband bought me. As an aforementioned true crime addict, I'm always on edge. I called up my husband for reassurance, and he assured me it was probably just a homeless guy, but to keep the gun at the ready and the dogs by my bed, just in case. I start doing my nightly routine and head to bed. As I'm falling asleep though, my dogs start going wild, barking and rushing from door to window. I kept my hand on my gun as I listened to them barking over the pounding of my own heart. I could hear the front door knob rattling as someone tried to twist it open. My dogs were still snarling and barking. After a few seconds, one of them hit the window downstairs, barking their head off. I slid out of my bed and grabbed my cell phone, dialing 911. About 30 minutes later, cop cars pulled into my yard and took my statement. I was still terrified and shaking, and when I went to the door to talk to them, the porch light illuminated footsteps all around my door in the snow. They circled around to each window. I could only imagine it was that same guy from the church earlier, but I have no idea how he knew which house was mine. I parked in the garage, so he must have been watching me as I came home, and recognized my vehicle as I pulled in. My husband is home now, but I'm scared stiff. I won't even walk in front of our uncurtained French doors. I'm that terrified. I've almost been kidnapped twice. This is the story about the second time. I just graduated from college and was living outside the major city my school was near. There's public transit around here that's relatively reliable, so sometimes I would go into the city for special occasions, knowing I could get back safely. For Halloween that year, my boyfriend and I decided to take the train and actually go to an event, not just a house party. This is only important because of how it influenced my outfit. As a woman, there are a lot of footwear rules you have to follow. I was worried if I didn't wear heels, I might not be allowed into the club we were going to. I honestly debated for way too long and switched between heels and flats a couple of times. I was wearing a black dress that I turned into a black widow spider costume by putting a red cutout on the front. In the end, I ended up wearing some black sneakers. The night was great and relatively uneventful. I didn't get hassled for my shoe wear at all, thankfully. At some point, I decided I was exhausted though and wanted to head home. My boyfriend was still going strong and didn't really want to leave yet. That wasn't really a problem though. Since we'd taken public transportation to get there, he gave me the keys to his house, which was about a mile from the train station. We planned that I would head back and he would join me a little bit later. The mile I had to cover went by a mall, a school, and finally a church, and abruptly ended and turned into a row of houses that my boyfriend lived on. There was a designated sidewalk the whole way, but it also ran along a 4-lane road. I knew there was potential for running into late-night vagabonds, but I figured they'd mostly be around the station or the mall. By the time I was at the church, I could see my destination, which was the second house on the row. I considered myself safe as I passed the church on the right sidewalk. I was about 200 yards from the house now, when I hear a vehicle start to slow down as it approaches me on the left. The speed limit for the area was 35, but people often fly down it. I'd say about average, people go around 45 miles an hour on this road, given that there were 2 lanes each way. The van had been going 45 as well, because the sound of it slowing down rapidly was very noticeable. I turned and saw a white, hard-sided, really dark-tinted front window van pulling over. Luckily, it was going so fast it was not able to stop until it had passed me by, about 20 yards ahead. It just sat there, idling at the sidewalk. I stopped walking because there was no reason for a van to just suddenly stop like this out of nowhere. I didn't want to walk by the big sliding door. After about 30 seconds, which felt like an hour, of the van just idling there and no one getting out at all, I decided to quickly scoot on up to the church flower beds so I wouldn't be close enough to be grabbed by anyone. At first, nothing happened as I passed by, and I felt dumb for being paranoid. That's exactly when I sent 1,000 prayers for deciding to wear flats that night. After 10 seconds of me walking onward, I heard the van gun its engine, and I watched as it zoomed by and screeched to a stop in front of me, about 10 feet away. It literally jumped the curb onto the sidewalk, with the tail sticking out into the road. Hearing the driver's door now opening sent a jolt of adrenaline I've never felt before or since through my body. I took off sprinting in my glorious sneakers. As I passed the front of the van, I saw the driver passing the side mirror, meaning he was already outside the car, attempting to make his way to me. As anticlimactic as it is, that's basically the end of the story though, because I hauled my ass all the way to my house without stopping, running the fastest I've ever run. I'm pretty sure I could have given an Olympic athlete a run for their money. I even cut through some trees to lose him. I wasn't pursued any further. As far as I could tell, the man chasing me was not able to keep up. I got inside and locked the door, and spent the rest of the night just fine. I'll always be grateful I ended up wearing flats that night, so I could run for my life properly. I don't really like considering what might have happened if I had been wearing heels instead. Hello everyone, let me introduce myself. My name is Tony and I live in Paris. I decided this summer, with the health crisis and all, to stay in France and go south for the holidays. Going to the PACA region more precisely. Unfortunately, it didn't exactly go as planned. I'm going to tell you this story so that everyone can realize that you have to be wary of everyone at all times, especially if you're going to a place where you don't know anyone. Like I'd said, my girlfriend and I decided to go to the PACA region for the holidays. We rented an apartment on Airbnb. It wasn't the first time we'd rented on this platform, and so far it had always gone quite well. We were able to see different photos of the apartment, so we were sure of our choice, especially since the apartment was in a private residence in the city center. As you know, you can see the photo of the owner of the rental property as well, except this one, there was no photo. And to avoid having too many problems, we'll call the owner Paul. On the day of departure, my girlfriend and I were super happy to discover everything in the region. The trip was going great so far. We'd arrived a little bit early, and so we decided to tour the city a bit before we could check into the apartment at 6 p.m. At around 5:30, we headed over to the address. I parked my car on the street where the residence was located. We received a message from Paul, who told us he would arrive in 10 minutes. 10 minutes passed by and we arrived in front of the entrance to the residence. The man got out of his car and called out to us. "Hey, you the guys that rented my apartment?" I instinctively answered yes, asking him if he was really Paul. After all, there was no photo provided. The man in front of me said yes, and we were reassured. The man was quite well dressed and didn't seem to be acting suspicious at all. He took us over to his apartment. We passed through the exterior parking lot of the residence before arriving in front of the building in question. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, and there was an elevator up to it. My first observation was that the apartment was slightly different from what had been represented in the photos. It wasn't like shockingly different or anything. It basically could have amounted to a simple change in decorations. The second observation was we wouldn't have thought the apartment was for rent at all, for several reasons. There were crumbs on the table, there were dishes stored in the sink, and things scattered all around. It looked as if someone was living there permanently, not renting it out to tourists. To tell you the truth, that didn't really worry me though. I told myself it was possible that Paul lived here and rented his apartment whenever he went out from time to time. That in itself was not super weird. I didn't care that the apartment wasn't too clean. We were going to be out enjoying our vacation anyway. That really should have caught my attention though. There was one thing that alerted and warned me now though. Paul's behavior became quite strange as soon as we entered the premises. Why, you ask? Well, because he had very specific rules on where we could pack our things away. For example, in the bedroom there was this small shelf with storage drawers. Paul told us that was where we should store our wallets and valuable jewelry. In fact, his tone of voice encouraged us to put our valuables there right now, as if he needed to know where we were going to be storing these precious belongings. Paul also began asking us more and more personal questions. Did we have any family here? Did we know the surroundings well? Was it our first time here? Did we live far away? At the time, I replied we did have family here, even though we didn't at all. My instincts were telling me to be wary of this person. Even though I'm telling you this in a lot of detail, you have to remember that I only noticed all these things in a couple of minutes max. It was a first glance sort of thing. If you were not a paranoid person, I don't think you'd really think anything was that abnormal about this situation. The worst was yet to come though. The tour was about to end and Paul had to leave the keys with us. Before he left, I had the strong urge to go to the bathroom, so my girlfriend stayed to talk with Paul. I go to wash my hands, and then my phone vibrates. On my screen, I see Paul's number. Well, that's strange. Why would Paul be sending me a message if he's right in the next room talking to my girlfriend? I open my phone, only to become immediately petrified. Hey guys, sorry for the delay. My car broke down on the road. I'll be there in about 15 to 20 minutes. I saw the message was sent only 1 minute ago. I quickly realized that if Paul had broken down his car, then the man that was with us was not Paul at all. I was in a total panic. I came out of the bathroom and tried to keep a poker face as best as I could. This false Paul asked me if I was okay. I told him yes, and asked my girlfriend to come with me to unload the car. I was planning to leave right away and notify the police without this stranger noticing anything. Problem was, as soon as we went to leave, this fake Paul insisted on helping us unload. I told myself he might try to do something to us once our suitcases were brought inside. An attack? A theft? Who knows? I got in on his game and told him to stay at the foot of the elevator so we could take the suitcases to him and he could bring them up to the apartment while my girlfriend and I unloaded the car. Thankfully, he was fooled. My girlfriend and I went downstairs while Paul waited for the suitcases as planned. Arriving on the ground floor, I hastened to tell my girlfriend everything and even showed her the message as well. She really started panicking. I then told her the best thing to do was call the police and then join up with the real Paul. My girlfriend called the police and explained the situation to them, while I also called Paul and asked if he was coming soon. The police said they would arrive on scene in 10 minutes. I took my car with my girlfriend inside and parked it on the street opposite the residence, just in case the false Paul came down to get us. The real Paul sent me a message telling us he had arrived. We joined him and immediately I felt reassured. The man in front of me really inspired me with some confidence. He was very professional. We decided to tell him the whole story very quickly. He immediately understood our dismay. He told us he thought he knew who the man was who was pretending to be him. It would be a man named Lorenzo who lived in an apartment located in the same residence as Paul. Lorenzo was a tenant who caused many problems, according to him. The police arrived and we decided to take them to the residence directly. Arriving at the parking lot, we see a silhouette in the distance though. It was Lorenzo. When he saw the police, he went completely crazy. He began insulting us, saying everything was our fault, and that it had really now come to this. His speech was incomprehensible. He was going berserk. The police arrested him after a struggle, and we didn't hear from Lorenzo for 3 days. In the meantime, Paul moved us into his real apartment, which matched the photos perfectly and was very clean. The police called us 3 days after. It turns out Lorenzo had lost his job due to the health crisis, and his landlord had evicted him from the apartment in which he was staying for non-payment of rent. In addition, Lorenzo seemed to have an addiction to some kind of drug, which explained his mood swings. The police think that Lorenzo wanted to steal as many valuable items as possible from us to resell them, or possibly worse. He was placed under police surveillance while a doctor came to establish a behavioral diagnosis. And so, that's my story. Apart from those events, our vacation actually went really well, even if we were really freaked out at the time, and even a little during the rest of the vacation, I'll admit. This story is to tell you to be careful when renting something out in a place you don't know anyone. Always ask for a photo of the owner of the property. Thankfully, the real Paul was a nice guy, but you never know. I hope this story can help you all one day.